Hello everyone, in today's video I want to talk about this camera, the Sony A7, the original one, which came out in, I think, in November of 2013, which is a long time ago. And since then there have been a lot more recent Sony cameras like the A7R4, which is the newest one. But what I think is special about this camera is that it's the cheapest modern full-frame camera. It features a 24 megapixel full-frame sensor, as you can see here, and it shoots 1080p video with 25p or 50p, which is great and gives you some slow motion option. And in today's video I want to focus mainly on the video aspect of the Sony A7. So yeah, since this camera came out in 2013, late 2013, it doesn't have 4K as I said, and the 1080p video that it produces is actually not that great. It uses a pretty old codec, which is the AVC HD codec, and so the footage you'll get out of this camera is pretty soft compared to modern 1080p cameras from, for example, Panasonic or modern Sony cameras. And yeah, that is a bit of a downside, but if you're only going to view it on your phone screen, it is not going to be that big of a problem, and you most likely won't even notice the softness if you're shooting in good light. But if you're shooting in low light, it may become a bit of a problem because the image softens up a lot more in low light. It introduces a lot more noise than you would expect from a full-frame camera. It looks more like an APS-C camera, to be honest, and that is not great. But one advantage of the full-frame sensor in the A7 is that you can produce a lot of shallow depth of field. For example, compared to my Panasonic G7, which has a micro 4/3 sensor, which is 4 times smaller than the sensor in the A7, and that means that the A7 has twice the shallow depth of field of any micro 4/3 camera, which is really great if you want to separate your subject from the background, and it makes it just look much more cinematic. So the lens I have on here is the kit lens. It is a 20 to 70 millimeters, and it's actually quite a cheap kit lens. It costs used around $100 to $200, which is actually a pretty great price for a full frame kit lens, and it is actually fairly sharp, especially if you stop it down. It only is an f3.5 to 5.6 aperture, but since this camera is a full frame camera, it will still produce a lot of shallow depth of field, even with its kit lens, which is one of the things I really like about this camera, that you can just get pretty good shallow depth of field even with a cheap lens. So some other things I love about the Panasonic G7 in terms of video is that it has a flip screen, which makes it really great for filming. Like I usually film, I have the camera maybe at waist level and look down on it, and this is where the flip screen really comes in handy. Another thing about the kit lens, which I really recommend you get, because it has also got image stabilization, which actually works pretty great, and I think it is even comparable to embodied image stabilization of earlier Panasonic cameras. And yes, it helps a tremendous amount in stabilizing your videos and also makes them look much more cinematic. Another thing about the body, which is actually pretty small, as you can see just without the lens, it has a pretty small grip, and the grip is actually one of the few differences that you can notice just from looking at it to newer A7 cameras. They have a much bigger grip than this one, but I actually don't think that this grip feels bad. My fingers go around it pretty nicely, and it feels pretty solid in my opinion. And yeah, and since it is a mirrorless camera, you also have an EVF, which helps you with shooting in bright sunlight when you maybe can't really see the screen, because the screen has actually got a pretty poor high brightness level, which means that you can't really see the screen if it gets too bright, which is really not great. And also in terms of the body, another thing is the controllability of your manual video. this camera actually has 3 exposure change dials. I have this dial on the back which I use to change the ISO, this dial on the front for the aperture, this dial on the back for changing the shutter speed, and that makes the process for changing the exposure really fast. So in terms of picture profile, what I shoot on the A7 is usually I turn the saturation and the contrast a bit down, which I think may give me some advantage in terms of dynamic range, but I have compared the image of the flatter profile picture to the normal profile picture, and the difference is actually pretty minor. If you grade it, you mostly can't even tell the difference, so you'd be just fine if you shoot in the normal profile picture and don't shoot flat. Also, another thing I want to mention about the body is that it is weather sealed, which I really think is a really important feature in cameras, because I take them out in the rain and in wet environments all the time, and it just makes it a more robust and more usable camera. Another pretty pro video feature actually is that it has a microphone and a headphone jack, which most cameras don't have, especially this price range, and gives you the opportunity to monitor your audio, which I actually use really rarely, but if you're into those kind of things, you will love this camera. Some other things which kind of annoy me about the camera, that the record button, which is placed here on the back, is really hard to reach, and you have to kind of crank your fingers around the body to reach it, and I really don't like that. It makes it just a little bit slower to start recording. Another thing I don't like, if you make the profile flatter, it will actually stay the same in all the photo profiles. It doesn't change automatically to the normal picture profile if you change the mode from video to photo, which is really annoying. So another thing, not just with the Sony A7 but with any mirrorless camera, is that it has no mirror in between the sensor and the lens mount, which means that you can have an adapter at this place instead, which means you can adapt cheap old DSLR lenses like this 17 to 35mm from Sigma, which is actually originally for the Nikon F mount, but I've adapted it to the Sony E mount. What is great about this lens is just that it is really cheap. It has an aperture ring, which you need to have in lenses which you adapt, because you can control the aperture if the adapter has no electrical contacts. And this lens actually cost me just over $120, which is really great for an f2.8-4 wide-angle lens. And since you don't have any electrical contacts in most adapters, you need to manual focus. And what is great about the camera regarding the manual focus is that you have focus peaking, and you can punch into the image even while you're recording to check if your focus is on the subject, which is really useful. Now, if you're not comfortable with focusing manually, this camera of course also has autofocus, and it actually works pretty amazing considering its age, and it's pretty reliable and acquires focus pretty quickly. It's not comparable to Canon's dual pixel autofocus, but I think it's more than useful. And also, as you can see, the shallow depth of field just of the f3.5 kit lens at 28mm is pretty great. So considering all those points I've just mentioned, would I recommend the A7 in 2020 for shooting video? Well, I mean, if you're on a really tight budget and you don't mind soft video, I would definitely recommend this camera. Competitors to this camera are, in my opinion, the Nikon D600 and the Canon 6D, which are pretty similar cameras. But one advantage of the Canon 6D, I think, in my opinion, is that you can download Magic Lantern onto it, which is kind of a hack, which enables the camera to shoot raw video, which you can't do on this camera. And that means you get a huge amount of flexibility in post for grading, and that may be an advantage of the Canon 6D, but a disadvantage of the Canon 6D is that you can't shoot in any frame rate over 30 frames per second, which means you can't slow it down, and make it more stable or look more cinematic. So I still think this camera is a great option for anyone who's looking for a budget full frame camera to make videos on. And yeah guys, that was my review of the A7. I really love this camera. Also for photography, which I actually use it for mainly. And I've just started shooting video on it recently and discovered that it's actually a pretty capable camera in terms of video. So yeah, if you liked that video, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down, I guess. I would be really thankful if you subscribe to me, and I wish you a really beautiful day.